rehearsing and nursing a part. We know every part by heart.
Hello there, true believers. This is Head Speaks, a proud member of the Headcast Network family of shows. As usual, I am your host, Aaron Moss, aka Head. This is my mostly monthly Headcast, where I talk about comics, movies, role-playing games, TV shows, and anything else geeky that I want. So sit back and enjoy the ride. Let's begin.
Faster than a speeding bullet.
In the great hall of the Justice League,
Spider-Man and his amazing friends.
the Justice League of America versus the Legion of Doom. This is
What's in Head's Long Box?
Dedicated to truth, justice, and peace for all mankind. The world's greatest super friends.
And welcome back to this segment of What's in Head's Long Box. Today, we are continuing my multi-epic look at the Armageddon 2001 crossover, for better or worse. And today we're looking at the new We're looking at the new Titans Annual. They dropped the teens by this point. This was the new Titans Annual number 7. But before I bring you that book, let me go ahead and introduce the people I have on my podcast this episode. For the first time, I have the wonderful Tom Panarese. Hey, Tom.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing good. It's a pleasure to finally speak with you. And like I was saying before we got recording, I've listened to your show, so it seems like we've talked before, but I just realized, you know what? No, this is the first time we've actually talked face-to-face, in quotes.
Yeah, I've felt that way about a number of people in our little podcasting herd. You know, it's just I feel like I know like you guys way more than I've actually spent talking to a lot of you guys, so I totally know where you're coming from.
And also joining us this episode, I'm bringing back Mr. Clinton Robinson.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Hey, Clinton.
Hey, Aaron. How's it going? Hi, Tom.
Doing good.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Nice to meet you finally.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have you back, Clinton. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. So before we get going with the actual show, we've already talked with Clinton in the past, so let's introduce you to Mr. Panarese. Tom, why don't you tell everybody out there a little about your comic book origins, how you got into comics, things like that.
My first kind of foray into comics was about 86 to 87 with G.I. Joe, the Transformers, and a few other comics. But my real, like, where I got sucked in and hung on for the better part of, well, what are we up to? Probably about 37 or 38 years. Or no, not 30. We're not up to 30 yet. We're up to, I can't do math. I teach English. 27, 28 years. We're almost to 30. It was about 1990. And a friend of mine had loaned me A Lonely Place of Dying and the Death in the Family Trade. Because I had heard of the Jason Todd getting killed thing, because I had been, in the 2 or 3 years since I stopped reading, G.I. Joe, I had flitted in and out of the comic store on occasion. I would pick up a book here and there. And Batman had come out the year before the film, so a couple of people I knew were really getting back into it. And so my friend loaned me that. He loaned me A Lonely Place of Dying, and then a few random other books he had. I remember the 2-parter from Detective that introduced anarchy very vividly, and I remember loving that. And so I started picking up the books with my first Batman issue was Batman 452, Dark Knight, Dark City storyline, and then my first. But what I was really, really focused on was Detective at the time, because my first issues were 617 and 618. And 617 was this really strange Joker story, but 618 was where Tim Drake's parents got kidnapped. So I was doing Batman and Detective, and then the same friend who loaned me Lonely Place of Dying said, you should pick up New Titans because that's where Nightwing is. And I knew who Nightwing was because I knew he was Dick Grayson, et cetera, et cetera. So my very first issue of New Titans was New Titans number 71, which is the very first part of the Titans Hunt storyline, which leads into the annual we're going to be reading here. So it really started there, and then I don't think I would have considered hanging on as long as I did if another guy down the street from me hadn't been kind of offloading a ton of his comics, and I picked up a bunch, and they were a bunch from the late or mid to late 80s, but one of them was Crisis on Infinite Earths number 12. And I read the cover off that book, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go back and get all the other 11 issues. So by the time Armageddon 2001 rolls around, I was really into the whole idea of the DC universe, because a lot of what I saw in Crisis reminded me of what I used to watch on the Super Friends and the Superpowers, all that stuff when I was younger. So and I kind of never really looked back. I mean, my friend and I used to write letters into the Titans, and we're really into Robin, and I don't read the Titans anymore. I stopped right at the end of the old 52, not the old DC rep pre-New 52, and I don't pick up a lot of DC now, to be completely honest with you, but I still do read comics and have a lot of trades. Not as many comics as I used to, but a lot of graphic novels and trade paperbacks.
Right on. And so you said you started reading the Titans right before this story. Mm-hmm. So you picked up the Armageddon 2001 annual. Did you read the entire Armageddon 2001 at that time?
Yeah, I was more or less in on this from the ground floor. I might have had to pick up a second printing of, it might have been the Batman or the Superman annual, because I think my comic shop sold out of them pretty quickly, and being that this is 1991, so I was about 13, 14 at the time, so my funds were pretty limited in terms of what I could afford to buy month to month. So an annual was a decent amount of money. I got Armageddon 2001 number 1 off the rack, and then I would eventually get the second printing of, it might have been both the Batman and Superman annuals, and then I went flat out, was along for the ride all the way up to number 2, and I had figured out what I thought was the identity of Monarch, because at the time this was going on, I was also reading the War of the Gods crossover, and there was a book that was ending, and I was like, oh, this guy's going to be Monarch. It all makes sense. And then the ending was what I didn't expect, and there's a reason behind that, but I'm sure you'll get to that at a later date.
Yeah, we'll talk about that at some point, but yeah. Yeah.
So this is actually really my first DC crossover, that I was live for.
Right on, that's why it's always special. Mm-hmm. Mine was Invasion. So I'm sure this holds, much like Invasion holds a special place in my heart, I'm sure this is kind of special for you then. Your first big crossover. Yeah,
even despite the ending, I loved this crossover.
Yes, same here. That's why I'm devoting, I'd say, a year and a half of my podcast life to it. But let's... Hey, we've already talked to Clint about all this, so let's go ahead and move on to the actual comic itself. We're looking at the New Titans Annual number 7. This was cover date of 1991. To buy it off the stand, you had to be buying comics August the 6th of 1991.
It's my sister's
the cover price was $3.50. Oh, happy birthday to her. This was her birthday present. Whether it's a good or bad present, we'll find out here in a little bit. You're talking about the price of the annuals. This was $3.50. Yeah. And the title of this story was called 2001, A Titan's Odyssey. Written by Marv Wolfman, penciled by Tom Grindberger, inker Will Bleiberg, inker was Ian Aiken, also as Alvey, letterer John Costanza, colorist Adrian Roy, and editor was Jonathan Peterson. And the cover was done by Tom Grindberg. These are my notes on this. This story takes place at the tail end of the Titans Hunt storyline, which started in New Titans 71 and ended around issue 84. And Tom mentioned that earlier. I actually like the Titans Hunt story for the most part. I have some problems with the ending, but that's another story entirely for a different podcast I'll doing at some point. The synopsis for this issue. As per most of these stories, our tale starts with Wave Rider thinking of his past and the future. He wonders if the Titans are bound to become monarch, so he goes to find them who are currently battling the Wildebeest Society. Wave Rider possesses one of the Wildebeest and touches the captured Nightwing. 10 years in the future, we find a ponytailed Nightwing fighting some drug dealers / makers, something like that. His fellow Titan Redwing swoops in his system. The police show up and attempt to arrest our heroes as they oppose Lord Chaos. The two Titans make their escape. With teammate Kilowatt's help, they evade the police skimmers and return to their HQ, which is a destroyed Batcave. Here we find the rest of the team as they discuss their plans to take on Lord Chaos and that the original Titans are believed to be dead. We also find out that there are other Teen Titans out there, and their boss, in quotes, keeps them separated. Terra shows up with a coded message letting the team know where to go next. We then find ourselves in a meeting with Lord Chaos and his board, where we find out that he is keeping the populace drugged and sedated. The Titans attack Chaos's floating base, and as expected, are winning the battle. Seeing this, Lord Chaos sets the craft to self-destruct with his board on board. Of course, the Titans escape. Later, Charlie tells Nightwing that the Titans are indeed dead at the hands of the Wildebeest, who was wiped out by Lord Chaos. To add insult to injury, Nightwing finds out that Chaos's HQ is at the site of the old Titans HQ. As the team infiltrates the base, they are confronted by Lord Chaos. Chaos takes the team out and then monologues to them, letting Nightwing know that yes, his friends were all killed, except for Donna Troy, who is pregnant with him. After a little more exposition, we find out that Lord Chaos has teamed up with aliens who he's agreed to help. A little more fighting, and the Titans take out Chaos's building, even though Lord Chaos escaped. We return to the present as Wave Rider realizes that Nightwing isn't Monarch. He thinks how these other Titans are real, they're not just a part of Nightwing's potential. This story ends with an epilogue of the future Titans as a mysterious leader says they need to travel to the past to kill Wonder Girl, Troya, Donna Troy, whoever. To be continued. And real quick before we go on with this issue, some after effects on this.
Spoilers!
During the 0 Hour event, Kilowatt, Redwing, Dagon, also known as Knight Rider, Pressure John, and Battalion are all revealed to be from a false timeline created by the villainous Monarch to act as a sleeper agent assassins during the time crisis. When Monarch, who had turned himself into the time villain extant, which is, I guess, spoilers for futures stories, is defeated, his false futures are destroyed, and the heroes from these futures are erased from existence. Mirage, Terra, and Deathwing survive. It is later established that they are from the current timeline and were shown through time and given false memories by the Time Trapper, who wished to use them as sleeper agents against extant. Which gets a little confusing, but we'll deal with that later. So let's go ahead and look at the actual comic itself before we do anything else. Like I normally do, we're going to look at the cover. The cover of this one's got the trade dress Armageddon 2001 along the top, the new Titans. We see Monarch in the background. In front of them, we see Nightwing and the rest of his Teen Titan group. We got our cover blurbs on here. They're here at last, introducing the all-new, all-great Teen Titans. But what is their relationship to Monarch? The answer may stun you. And I'll address that in a little bit, but let's go and talk about the cover. Tom, what do you think about this cover?
I think, in hindsight, it's clever that they ended up, when we fast forward 3 years to 0 Hour, that they ended up kind of going all the way back to this cover to wrap up the team, what would then become the Team Titans, because behind the scenes stuff and what you can read in online, as well as the Tomorrow's book, The Titans Companion, and interviews with John Peterson and Marv Wolfman, and then Jeff Jensen and Phil Jimenez, who took over the book at some point. Like, Monarch was never originally supposed to be the leader of the Titans, but they, because they were canceling the book, DC was like, well, this works, do it, and introduce Monarch, because the original leader was actually, I believe it was supposed to be Danny Chase, and Peterson wanted to make Danny Chase cool, but which is really, really hard because he is the cousin Oliver of the Titans. But I think it's a really effective book cover, especially because the blurbs is something they had been doing since issue 71, where they put some sort of like 75 was one of those classic, like, Dick ripped the mask off of a wildebeest, and it was one of those classic I can't believe it covers. I think he actually says not you, and in the end of that issue it's revealed that Jericho's the leader of the wildebeest. And then so they put these like crazy like blurbs like introducing Panther and Phantasm, and it was to get you like excited for what was inside. It was almost like a very, very Stan Lee Marvel type of approach, and it worked. I mean, the book started when Peterson took over the book with I think it was issue like 70, 69 or 70 or whatever. The book was basically on the verge of cancellation, and Peterson was Mike Carlin's assistant editor at the time, and Carlin had been editing the book. So they gave it to Peterson because it was like, we're probably going to cancel this book. Here's a tryout for a term as an editor, and if you do well enough, maybe we can get you a more high profile book or whatever. It's clearly like, this thing's on its last legs. Let's give it to the kid to see how well he does with it. And it took off, and it really did sell very well, especially once they got the shipping issues and deadline issues worked out. At the end of issue 79, they reveal these Teen Titans are revealed, because through the last few issues, like 77, 78, and 79, there have been kind of interludes, like a page here, a page there, a panel here, a panel there, of like somebody's lurking in the background and they're communicating with these wristbands, and like we don't know who they are. And there's been all this mystery surrounding the wildebeest and the Titans and all this stuff. Like, this is just another layer to it. And the last page of the issue 79 reveals that not only are these the Teen Titans, but Terra is one of them. And it was just this like, wait, what? Like, nobody saw this coming. And it was just so, and this led right into the annual, and then the annual leads right into issue 80. And then you have this War of the Gods crossover for 81. And then you have the three-parter that ends the whole Titans hunt. So this is really effective, considering if you were a Titans fan, you had just been blown away by the end of 79, and this came out right after it. So they knew where they were coming from with this.
Very much so. Very good. And Clinton, what are your thoughts on this cover?
This cover, I wasn't reading Teen Titans at the time, obviously, or New Titans, or whatever you wanted to call it. The cover really hooked me, though, especially, once I actually really got into DC and learned that Nightwing was Dick Grayson all grown up. So I'm like, okay, reading about Dick Grayson, doing this, hanging out with Titans. Okay, cool. And then I see the ad, and I don't even remember what issue it was, but, with some comic that had this as one of the, out this month ads, and I'm seeing Nightwing just charging along with this Captain America shield and a gun, and all these people who apparently are not the Titans. And I'm like, oh, okay, what the heck is going on? And of course, being 11, 12 years old at the time, I was an easy mark for the dark alternate future and all that. And it's like, oh my God, this is what's going to happen in the future of the comic. Okay. And it took forever to track this down, because I'm hunting LCSs left and right, checking out back bins. Believe it or not, this was at one time a hard book to come across, people.
Those early Titans Hunt issues are not plentiful in back issue bins, I've found, either. I don't know if they were low print runs or what, but...
Well, probably as poor as the Titans were doing, it probably didn't have a high print run at that point. Yeah, I'm not sure I was buying Titans at that point. I was actually enjoying it, so I don't know. But as far as my thoughts, I said it's a great cover. I said we get the Titans of the future in quotes. And again, if you're an old Titans fan, you'll see Terra on there, like, what the heck? You see Nightwing in his new costume with the shield and the gun. It just makes you, what the heck's going on here? My only problem in quotes with the cover is, as we talk about, and again, it's very, as you said, Tom, very Stan Lee-ish, well, what is the relationship to Monarch? The answer may stun you. Unless I missed something, they don't really give you the answer to that in this book, though.
No, they don't.
And and I don't mind a slow burn, but yeah, when you have it on the cover, what is the answer? What is relationship? The answer may stun you. Well, when you get to the answer, yeah, I don't know about having it on here, though. In fact, we'll get to that here in a little bit about the whole mark in it, but As a cover by itself, I really like this.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go and get some ratings on this, though. Tom, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being horrible, 3 being a pretty good cover, and 5 being fantastic, what would you give this book?
I'd probably give it the cover about a 4. I think that you're right. Like, when you get to the end of it, you're like, well, there is no real relationship to Monarch, so you kind of misled me there. As a sales point, it's really good. I like I like how Monarch frames the Titans busting out there. Grinberg's drawings could have used a little more detail on some of the figures of the Titans themselves.
Right.
But overall, I thought I would give it a 4. It's not like my favorite cover of this era, but it's definitely eye-catching.
Very nice. And Clinton, what would you give this cover on a 1 to 5?
I gotta agree with Tom. It's a 4. It does everything that it sets out to do. It captures your interest. Like I said, I wasn't reading it, but it drew me in. Again, a lot of the figures are lacking detail, but if they wanted to retouch it and blow it up to poster size, I wouldn't mind hanging it up on my wall.
And I'm going to have to agree with both of you guys. I'll have to give it a 4 also. I do agree that, some of the figures could use some detailing. To me personally, knowing the story and what's going to happen, I think I would have preferred to leave off that blurb about, what's the relationship to Monarch. As we said, it's kind of misleading. Either that or replace it with Lord Chaos instead of Monarch. And, what's the relationship to Lord Chaos? Because that actually does get answered. But then it wouldn't tie quite as much into the Armageddon, and that's what they're going for. So, it's a good, strong cover, so I would give it a 4 also. And now let's get some thoughts on the story itself. Let's go ahead and start with Clinton this time. Clinton, what are your thoughts about the actual story?
Oh, you mean the least Nightwing story you're ever going to read about Nightwing? Yeah,
that pretty much sums it up.
Well, other than, Dick Grayson being proto-90s extreme here with his armored shoulder pads and... I'm sorry, can we just address the elephant in the room? Why does he have a gun?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's very, very nice, because it's the 90s.
Okay, I'm starting to think this is like, I don't know, this is the Dick Grayson that everybody's picturing in their heads when they watch that Titans trailer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder maybe they read this book and that's why they...
It was like, I think years ago, I remember somebody was talking about this annual or the future Nightwing, and I think I said that he must have found a box labeled like Atari Force or Hex. It's something like right out of there. I do like the shield though. I will give I'll give them points in the Captain America shield. Then I gotta love the Captain America shield. So
yeah, but other than that, I really do like the story for the most part. Lord Chaos is a very interesting villain to me. Terra's honestly probably one of my favorite Titans, period, especially this version of Terra. I even like Mirage, and I know a lot of people don't like Mirage.
I like I've always liked Mirage. I always thought that they never wrote her. It's just like there's so many mistakes they made with a character like that. She could have been the Mystique of this group in a way, and but a good guy. And they made her do things. I was just like, nah, you didn't have to go there with some of the stuff that you did.
Yeah, I agree. Any other thoughts on this, Clinton?
No, overall, it's an above-average story, especially if you really want to think this is like right before Wolfman's big writer's block era, isn't it, Tom?
I'm trying to remember if it was before or right after. I know that
that's me.
Yeah, I think it might have been.
Yeah,
I think it might have been after.
Right before.
Well, I know that after 0 Hour, he ends up getting an editor whose name, at least in the interviews I've read, he won't even speak because he would submit And it was another young editor, and he would submit stuff to that editor, and then like the issue would come out, and like entire scenes would be re-dialogued and things like that. So that led to him basically quitting, and DC saying this is like 95, 96, and DC basically saying, all right, well, we were going to cancel the book anyway, so we'll give you somebody else for the last few issues, and you can just wrap it up the way you want to as best as you can. And the stuff after 0 Hour up until maybe the last few issues is like nearly unreadable. And I've listened to Mike Bailey go like through it on From Crisis to Crisis because Supergirl's guesting in it, and like he can barely get through it. And
Yeah.
Yeah, and all the characters are enjoyable. They're that great taste that doesn't taste great together.
Yeah. And Clinton, I'm the same with you on this Terra. I always loved this second version of the character up until they started belaboring the "is she the real Terra" thing, because that got really stale. But when in the pages of Teen Titans, especially when like Jensen and Jimenez were writing her and they were doing some different things with the character, I think they were going to make her like an Earth Elemental or something. It was really a really interesting way to do it. I thought this issue is a really good way to introduce and at least give the kind of establish this group without having to take us out of the story that we were in, because they took advantage of the fact that it was an annual and it was a crossover event. So for that, if it was Peterson directing it or was Wolfman, because Wolfman says like these were always meant to be one-off characters for the crossover, and it was editorial who were really like, no, let's make this whole part of something. Yeah. So, but even then, like, you know, even if it was just, if this was like, this is like a future group of Teen Titans, he gives you enough about all of them to make you like the characters in their adventure, and does make you, even if it didn't continue into the next issue, you'd always be curious to like, you know, what happened with those characters and that sort of stuff. It was an interesting concept.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I agree with that. It was interesting. It's just, yeah, usually where it comes down to is editorial interference does seem to cause a lot of problems. But you do what you have to do, I guess. Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't know. In addition to what I was saying, he world builds pretty decently. I like that page. It was page 15 with the Batcave, and you don't know how Bruce Wayne died. You just see a wrecked Batcave with a costume that was in a trophy case that's now wrecked, and the idea that like, you know, everybody, like even Bruce is gone, so like everybody's gone. I have to go back and look at Armageddon 2001, number 1 and 2, or number 1 especially, but I always thought that Chaos's police people looked just enough like Monarchs, and I think right around the time of they revealed Monarch to be the leader of the Teen Titans, my friend and I wrote a letter into, I don't think it was ever published, I think we just got a blurb in the last issue of Teen Titans, that we wrote in a letter explaining that like it makes sense because being that this was a former Titan, Monarch comes about and topples Lord Chaos and just kind of fills the gap there, and so there's like all this stuff that's established already, so it's almost like, you know, it would actually seamlessly go into Monarch's rule if this was the actual timeline, like one dictator replacing the other, you know, even though it doesn't fit Wave Rider's narrative. But no, overall, I think it's a really, really solid issue story-wise. The art, I'm hot and cold on, though. Grinberg does the Detective Comics annual. I don't know if you've done that one yet. Grinberg does the art of the Detective Comics annual, and he inks himself, and it's much better. And I think it's the art here suffers from the many hands inkers that we have, because we have 3 inkers and 1 penciler. And I think, and this is the case of some other artists too I've seen, I think it also suffers from the paper. The Detective Annual is on that classic comics newsprint paper, and I always like it on that. And Grinberg's art, I thought, I don't know if it's something on this, because this is like what they used to call the Baxter paper. And right. Just there's something about it. I don't know if it's the coloring or what, that it's it's always slightly off. It's always kind of like it's almost like a low rent Neil Adams type of, because it's very Neil Adams in places, and it would work if there's bits and pieces of it that are clunky. So, I think it takes away from the story a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that. And as far as Detective, I'm actually doing that next month with John Jack's going to be on talking about the Detective Comics annual. But yeah, I do agree that I went back and looked at the Armageddon 2001 issue, and the troopers are similar in appearance. As far as my thoughts on this, my major issue with this story is that I love crossovers. I love when books cross over with one another, but sometimes you can tell when it's a forced crossover, and to me this issue seems kind of forced, because other than Wave Rider showing up and looking at the beginning and the end, it's not really there's nothing about Monarch in the future. Like I said, you could hand wave it and say that, after Lord Chaos gets destroyed, Monarch steps in and picks up the pieces. That doesn't really, again, as you said, Tom, doesn't fit with the narrative of Armageddon 2001, where Monarch rose in 2001 from one of the heroes when most of the heroes appear not to be around in this storyline. So, if it was a standalone story by itself, maybe a what if or a future story or something, it's excellent. But yeah, that's part of that's my main problem with it, is that it doesn't fit very well with the narrative, as far as, because I don't see this future fitting in with what Wave Rider's described so far in the first issue. And I know that, and again, I've talked about that before, I'll talk about it in some other episodes, that when he touches people, the future changes. In fact, I'll talk about, again, in an upcoming episode, that how sometimes when he touches a hero, he touches Superman 3 times, he looked at Batman twice, which to me says that, well, if he touched him the first time, he didn't become Monarch, and you have to check him out a second time, well, did he become Monarch? That means that Monarch's actual identity isn't set in stone. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to check the same hero more than once, because no matter what their future holds, if he didn't become Monarch the first time, then why would he become Monarch the second time? But that's my problem with the whole crossover, which I'll get into more later. But as far as this issue, I do like you guys have said, I do like this version of Terra. I've read the original Terra in back issues. I wasn't reading comics when she came out. I did enjoy what I read of that Terra. But yeah, I do like this Terra more. Like Clinton was saying, I do like Mirage. I think Mirage, and as Tom said, it's a very underused and misused character later on. The rest of the Titans, you don't get a big feeling for me. There's a relationship between a couple of the Titans. There's two of them, brother and sister. But you get the vampire on the team. But overall, I think it was a good story by itself. It's just I have problems with the narrative fitting it into the whole Armageddon 2001 crossover. Like I said, I didn't really pay that much attention when I first read it until after you mentioned, Tom. But yeah, the costumes are similar to what Monarch's men would have later on or in the other stories, which again, it kind of has a nice narrative beat that way. But and then I can also mention that on the cover it tells us that we'll find out how Monarch's related. And overall, we do find out that apparently, I guess that the boss I talked about is Monarch, hiding his identity. But yeah, we don't find out in here. So
yeah.
How do you guys feel about Lord Chaos teaming up with these aliens for their help them take over Earth? We haven't mentioned the aliens that show up in here. Tom, what do you think about the aliens? Do you have any thoughts on them? Bit of the story.
I don't know how necessary they are, aside from just a way to explain why 10 years later they have so much advanced technology, like flying ships and things like that are a little bit beyond, or that, and then they're so proprietary to like him, as opposed to that, because if you look at some of the civilians walking around in some of the panels here and there, they're pretty normal looking people. So it's almost like, all of Chaos's people have the kind of this high tech stuff, and it explains like how he was able to take over so much of the world. So I guess it makes sense, but I don't think it's really ever followed up on that much beyond, because by the time you get into what would become total chaos and everything, he heads back, and that whole alien thing is just kind of like left in the future. So you could have left it out and had some other explanation for it. I think Chaos still would have worked as a villain. And
Clinton, do you have any thoughts on the aliens and the whole Lord Chaos teaming up to take over the Earth with the aliens?
Oh, you mean the aliens from planet Deus Ex Machina?
Yeah, you heard of them. Okay.
Yeah. I'm like Tom. They're here to help pretty much explain, exactly how Chaos could take over. One of those, well, I got technology from them, and they need manpower from me, so it's like, well, if the technology was that good, why couldn't they use it themselves? Plus, they all seem to die rather easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would have been a lot better without them. Because, again, as far as advanced technology, it's 10 years in the future. Look at almost any story where they're looking 10, 20 years in the future, and we've got flying cars, and we've got this futuristic stuff. Even in Armageddon 2001 was more, was about as futuristic as this. So I don't know if, personally, I think it probably would have worked a little better if they, because, again, I say, the aliens it's not really followed up on much, if at all. And like Clinton said, they go down rather easily. And the other thing that strikes me as odd is that the other timelines, this timeline seems different than the other books, because he does mention that this one here is a real timeline. It's not just a figment of Nightwing's potential.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the other one just is, a possible future, but this one's actually a real future that comes across as a little odd difference. And I know they did that just so they can continue on and bring this into, current continuity and the current books. But, again, fitting this one future as a real future where everything else is a possible future just seems kind of wrong to me. Clinton, do you have any other thoughts on this issue?
Yeah. Actually, as I was flipping back through it again, Grindberg's art, does he have an obsession with butt shots? Because, literally about every third page, you're going to have panels where there's, just for no apparent reason, people are drawn from the back.
Yeah, it's the start of the 90s.
Yeah, but, this is for all the people that want to make the Dick Grayson butt.
There's a lot of Nightwing buttons.
Yeah. And there's a lot of Nightwing butt, there's a lot of Redwing butt, there's a lot of Terra butt. Yeah. There's a fair amount of Mirage butt. Sometimes it's hard to tell which way Kilowatt is facing, so that may be his butt.
Yeah, very much so.
But yeah. No. Other than that, I would say it's an above average issue. It has problems, definitely, especially with, trying to tie into Monarch and all that. But at the same time, in my little headcanon as a child, it was, that Monarch and Lord Chaos were essentially the Skeletor and Hordak of, of their little areas. It's like, you go over here and do your thing, and I'll go over here and do my thing, and whichever one of us conquers the world first can kill the other one.
You know, Skeletor, your evil is almost a match for my own. Together we'll make life miserable for those Eternian fools. Why, it'll be just like the old days.
Yes, just like the old days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't look at it that way.
It is, as a crossover, very just like, if I don't think this is true, but if they had already created this story and Paul Levitz or Dick Giordano or Jeanette Kahn or somebody had come to John Peterson and said, you have to make the annual part of the crossover, and they added on like the 3 or 4 pages that directly deal with the crossover, I wouldn't be surprised. Because it works way better as this annual that introduces these characters in a way from the end of 79, and then like 80 picks them up where they were. Like it kind of catches up back to where we were at the end of 79 and keeps them going in the future. And if you want a book that's a crossover that you could like completely skip, New Titans 81 is that War of the Gods one. It kind of deals with Donna Troy, but it's basically Pariah whining for 24 pages. And it's really
it's a superstar.
So it's not as a crossover. It's not really essential, not in the way that those first couple of Superman and Batman annuals are, or like Justice League or Hawk and Dove and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, that's my big issue. Like I said previously, with is that and I was wondering the same thing that you mentioned, Tom, is maybe Marv already had this written out or plotted out, and we got this Armageddon 2001 crossover. You guys need to be a part of it. You need to write your annual, tie into it. Marv's like, all right, let me write these couple pages here, put this and this ending in. There you go. It's done. Because, it seems, like you say, you pull out those first couple pages, the top half of the last page, I think it would flow a lot better, and it'd be a lot better of a story. But any other thoughts on this, Tom?
No, I was just kind of looking to see if any of that was true, but it's really not. Like I said, it's what's interesting to me is just knowing the Titans' history. They hadn't really fully participated in a crossover since Crisis. Wolfman had this way of keeping them. I mean, like letting people use like 1 or 2 characters from the Titans in like Legends, Millennium, and Invasion, but conveniently most of the Titans were absent from all of that. Like Invasion took place while the Titans were out in space doing the Who Was Wonder Girl story, because there's interludes with like Danny Chase back at Titan's Tower talking to like Wally or Roy or somebody, and they're saying we're being invaded, and I don't know what they're doing during Millennium. I think Starfire, there's like a spotlight issue with that, but like this is the first time like the Titans were kind of like right into crossover. They would be like from this point on, like next year's annual will be part of the Eclipso event. And there was the Bloodlines annual introduced Anima, and it's as a crossover, it's kind of one of the weaker ones because it really has no bearing on the outcome of the story. But as a chapter in the Titans Hunt Total Chaos thing, it actually works pretty well.
And Clinton, did you have any other final thoughts? Did we get everything?
I think I'm good.
Okay. And real quick, Tom, you said when we talked on the Facebook thing, you were saying that you had information about the Teen Titans from the Titans Companion.
Just a little bit about like them and what John Peterson had originally planned for them, because he was talking about how basically like he was going to introduce them and then he spin them out into their own book after Total Chaos, which happened in the middle of Total Chaos. And Teen Titans #1 has 5 different issues, but unlike the X-Men #1, Teen Titans #1 has 5 backup stories that tell the origins of each of the things. So instead of buying 5 separate covers, you actually are buying a separate story. So that was kind of nice. But he had planned on keeping this team in that title and like having like tons of different teams, and eventually kind of creating a situation where you have the New Titans as the adult book and the Teen Titans becoming Teen Titans, kind of how they would eventually do in the 2000s, but also I think mirroring what the Legion of Superheroes was doing, where you had I don't know if they had started it by this time, but eventually Legion of Superheroes in the 5-year later time, and they would have the original, the flagship title, but they would also have the Legionnaires, which were the and I didn't read enough of this to really be an expert on this, but they were all like kind of teenage versions of what the adult Legion was. And I think that's what he was going for this, because he hinted at in this interview that he did in there that there was one of those Teen Titans, those many, many teams that looked like the original like Wolfman Perez Titans, and they were going to show up at some point. But he left DC altogether right at the beginning of that Total Chaos crossover. And he was supposed to be doing something at Image, maybe. I don't know why he left or what he went on to do, because he kind of disappeared after that. So and then the thing kind of meandered into territory that is in some places like pretty decent, and in other places you get like Titans number 100 onward, which in many cases ranges from pretty bad to like really awful.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree with you on that. Yeah, I'm a big Titans fan of this era, the Wolfman Perez. But yeah, I Titans up through issue 100 or so, and yeah, then it starts kind of what?
The Jeff Jensen, Phil Jimenez run, which starts around issue 11 or 12 of Teen Titans and goes up to the end, for a while there had a lot of potential, and you could see like where they were going, and then they got slammed by editorial because the book was going to get canned. So, I think they actually had like a year's worth of stories planned out, or 2 years worth of stories planned out, that they had to compress into like 5 issues or something. But it was they were doing some very interesting things with the characters, and for a while that was the book that I was more interested in than the New Titans, because I think this was around because when Teen Titans was sort of winding down, I think Bill Joska was on the art at Titans, and it was just like I pick it up because I was used to picking it up, but it was not great. So
yeah. All right. Well, unless you guys have any other thoughts on this, we're going to go ahead and drop this right here, and we'll be back next month with another segment looking at, I believe, another book. But before we go, Clinton, why don't you tell everybody out there once again where they can find you if they want to hear more of you?
Well, if they want to hear more from me, I do a podcast called Coffee and Comics Podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher Radio, or you can find it directly on the website, coffeeandcomicspodcast.blogspot.com. Or if they would like to just get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at Coffee Comics Blog.
Very nice. And Tom, if people want to hear more about you and want to hear from you, where can they find you more about you at?
I have 3 podcasts over on the Two True Freaks Network. The first one is In Country. I'm taking an issue-by-issue look at the NOM, the Marvel Comics series from the 80s and 90s. My main podcast is Pop Culture Affidavit, which is really just anything and everything random in popular culture, TV, movies, comics, books, music, whatever. You can also find that at popcultureaffidavit.com. And I have a third one, which is devoted to literature. It's called Required Reading with Tom and Stella. And me and Stella from the Batgirl the Oracle podcast take a look at one work of literature each month. And we, tear it open and decide whether or not, because we're both teachers, whether or not we would actually teach it, whether it's kind of evaluate its place in the canon, so to speak. And you can find that at requiredreadingwithtomandstella.com. And if you do want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at PopAff. That's spelled P-O-P-A-F-F.
Very nice. And I definitely recommend all those shows. You both Clinton and Tom, you have some great shows out there. I enjoy listening to them. But that'll do it for this time. I'm going to go take a break. Stay with us, and we'll be right back. Head Speaks will be back after these important messages.
Can I get a tall chai?
A large black coffee.
And I suppose you're here with no agenda, as per usual?
On the contrary, I'm here for comics.
I think I can help all of you. Hello, I'm the caffeinated Clinton Robinson, and I host a podcast called Coffee and Comics. On this podcast, I summarize, review, and discuss comic book issues, stories, and related media, usually in the span of time it takes to have a cup of coffee. Sometimes I'm joined by a guest, and sometimes I'm flying solo. So pour the coffee, take a sip, and turn up the volume as you listen to the Coffee and Comics Podcast. Available on iTunes, Stitcher, and directly on coffeeandcomicspodcast.blogspot.com. And remember, this is where the comics are never too old and the coffee is never too cold.
Oh, adolescents this generation have no respect and are a far cry from my sweet Jane Eyre and her friend Helen Burns. Why, just this afternoon I was
Stella,
Cross. And you know what? Men too. Well, where are the
Stella?
mysterious men like the tragic Mr. Rochester and Teachers? Pa! They're all like the villainous Mr. Brocklehurst.
Hey, Stella!
Yes, Thomas?
As much as I enjoy indulging your insanity, we have a promo to record.
Oh dear. And what might that be?
That is you and I telling everyone that we have a brand new podcast out there. It's called Required Reading with Tom and Stella. Once a month, we will take a look at a single work of literature, discuss it, analyze it, and determine if it's worth its place in the canon.
Oh dear, that sounds delightful.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. And you can find us on the Two True Freaks Network, which is at twotruefreaks.com.
Oh yes, Required Reading with Tom and... Why is it Tom and Stella? Why can't it be Stella and Tom?
It rolls off the tongue better?
Okay.
Well, that was easy. So, Required Reading with Tom and Stella at twotruefreaks.com. Thanks for contributing to the promo there. You did a great job.
Oh, you are so welcome.
It began with the origin of his comic book fandom.
This is the very first comic book I have ever read, and also ignited the spark of my comic book collecting over the course of a 1974 weekend.
Professor Xum Yukinori led an ongoing expedition through his favorite single-issue comic book stories from the Bronze Age of DC Comics.
Balance of Power,
Have Horse, Will Fly, Solomon Grundy, Wins on a Monday,
Superman's Unbeatable Rival,
Green Lantern, Master Criminal of the 25th Century.
With unique celebrity guest perspectives in an ambitious attempt to set this program apart from other comic book review podcasts.
Call me Terror Man. Solomon Grundy am co-host this time.
I am Lenos, the lexical archive of minutia, expositions, and origins.
Goodbye, me am Bizarro.
I am Libra.
This is Aya from the Green Lantern.
It is I, the Reverse Flash.
Which had ended with the destruction of the universe. Or has it?
Where in thunderation are we?
I regret to say that you are my prisoner.
Without our interspatial time conveyor, we are all essentially trapped here.
Can't summon the willpower necessary for my power ring to pull me free.
For nearly 2 decades, I had carried her ghost within my heart.
Experience the wonder.
Great wings of Mercury!
Of an all-new season.
Solomon Grundy fought little pointy-eared man before.
Let us get back to the story, shall we?
Down, down, and approach!
Of the Done in One Wonders podcast Wonder Show. Only on the Fire and Water Podcast Network.
Allow me, Entity Terror Man. That does it. They ain't messing with no timelines ever again.
And now back to Head Speaks. And welcome back to another segment of Behind the Podcast. And joining us this time, we have another extraordinary podcaster. I first heard of this gentleman over on the Who's Who's podcast. He would send them submissions for their missing Who's Who's pages. Who's Who's? DC characters didn't get a Who's Who's page. That's a lot of Who's Who's. They should have. And then he started his own show. So let's welcome to the show, Xum Yukinori. Hey there, Xum.
Hello, sir.
Welcome back. We talked over on my Armageddon 2001 about The Flash, and I just had you back to talk about your podcasting career and history and life. So.
Says You're talking to a man who hasn't even had 10 shows under his belt, by the way, just so you know. So,
That's
fledgling podcaster.
That's all right. You've got your own shows, plus you've heard other places, and like I say, I've heard you for, I don't know, it seems like forever on this Who's Who podcast, so...
Well, that's true, but...
Your entries.
Yes, I actually never voiced on the Who's Who podcast, but they gave me my own segment where they just talk about my artwork, but they didn't invite me on.
See, they should have you do that segment, maybe play it or something. I don't know.
Well, I'm building a book. I already have like a 32-page Zoom's Who Volume 1 all planned out. I even drew the cover a few years ago. So when all of those entries are complete, I will see about maybe doing a Zoom's Who episode. And, maybe I won't invite Robin Shag.
There you go. In fact, I think we need to write DC and tell them they need to commission you and actually publish this. I would love to see that.
Oh, they seem to have their own. They seem to have their own art team doing their faux Who's Who entries for the Young Animal line, which was great. It was a nice harkening back.
Oh yeah, I did see. I did see a couple of those in the early. When I first started, I did see a couple of those. Yeah, that was a nice throwback.
Yeah, it was.
But let's get on with you, actually. So
sure.
Let's start with what is the name of your show?
Oh yes. My show is the Done in One Wonders Podcast Wonder Show, and I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but it just rolls off the tongue, I thought.
I think it's a nice title.
Well, thank you.
And what is your show about? Why don't you tell the people listening a little bit about your show? What is it about? What do you do?
Sure. Well, it's essentially a comic book review and critique show, specifically focused on Done in One comic book stories. Most of the episodes I've done so far, and of course there have only been 5, they focus mostly on my favorite DC comic stories from the Bronze Age. But in the future, it may include stories from other publishers as well as from Silver Age and more recent years.
Very nice.
Yeah, well, just to, when you hear comic book review and critique show, you heard one, you heard them all. So I wanted to come up with something to help distinguish this podcast from other comic book review shows that are out there on the interwebs. So I introduced certain celebrity guests to provide a unique perspective on the stories that are covered. Now, these are celebrities that had not had any active work for years, right. And so they were willing to help me out because even the Comic Cons wouldn't have them come in to do autographs. You may know them as like Terraman, Solomon Grundy, Bizarro, and Lanos, who was the alternate AI navigational computer from Green Lantern, the animated series. They had become affectionately known as the Zoom Crew.
Very nice name. I like that, Zoom Crew.
I didn't even come up with it. That came from the comments. I was originally going to call them the Legion of Zoom. That was the title of my 5th episode, was Rise of the Legion of Zoom with an X. And right. But I think Zoom Crew is much better.
I like them both. I like the Legion of Zoom, but also you have the Zoom Crews that got a nice ring to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my wife's sitting here listening. She votes for Zoom Crew.
So do I. It takes me back to Captain Carrot.
Yeah.
So it was, we almost renamed the show Xum Yukinori and His Amazing Zoom Crew, but Terraman wanted to call it Terraman and His Amazing Zoom Crew. So that just yeah. Notice how I have a forced reality with my show. You're going to have to bear with that a little bit on this.
Oh no, that's fine. I've got my own reality in my head, so I can deal with yours. So, speaking of your show, how did you come up with the idea for this show?
Okay, well, I originally contemplated doing a podcast around a particular comic book series that I liked, like Green Lantern, for example, except there already was a Green Lantern podcast that does that. So I thought perhaps maybe something more obscure, like maybe the Super Friends comic book from the 1970s or Batman the Brave and the Bold, just to have a little variety because they had different guest stars coming in and out. But then I realized that if I focused on a series and started doing the series in order, I would fall into that trap of being obligated to cover comic book stories that I may not have particularly enjoyed, which is what Batman Nightcast is doing right now. They're essentially slogging through the Max Allan Collins run. I wanted to cover comic stories that I liked, but I needed a theme because I just could not go totally random. But the Brave and the Bold issues, they reminded me of how most of the comic books that I had read growing up, and I started reading comic books in 1973. They managed to tell a complete, and not just a complete story, but a very rich story in a single issue, usually in 17 pages or less. And I had always marveled at that, and unfortunately very few comic books do that today. But most comic book animated series episodes do it wonderfully. So I wanted to celebrate that age of compressed storytelling. So that was where the Done-in-One Wonders concept came from. And the theme was broad enough for me to cover any single issue comic book I want. And even the very first episode, I took exception because it was a comic book story that took place, or that would continue in the next issue. But, it was only the last 2 panels that really, added that cliffhanger. So I made the exception because it was the first comic book I ever bought. And I definitely wanted to cover my origin story of becoming a comic book fan in my very first episode. So with that one exception, everything else is a single issue comic book story. And my presentation format with actual comic book and animation characters being co-hosts, that allows me to cover comic books in hopefully a different enough way so that it would not clash with other podcasts that may cover the same comic book.
Well, that's a very nice distinction you have there. I like the fact that you have these other characters showing up and helping you with it. So that does, as you said, it brings a different taste to the show.
Well, thank you. I can't say that it's completely unique. I mean, I know that Diablo Frank had done dramatic reenactments of comic book stories where he would or would have a guest play various characters. And of course, there was the romance comics by Siskoid and his friends, Boss and Vern and I can't remember the fourth one. I'm sorry, but they would do these dramatic romance comic theater. So it's not a new concept, but I'd like to think that there aren't that many podcasts out there where a comic book character would actually be criticizing his own story.
And I agree. I mean, like I say, yeah, there's been other. I know Everyone Loves the Drake recently did a dramatic reenactment of the Lonely Place of Living storyline. But I like the concept that you have where, you have these recurring characters that come in, they'll critique their own stories, or I don't know, just it's an interesting little twist to it.
Yeah, and it kind of enables me to kind of put in my own little fan theories on why certain stories happened the way they did.
Right.
Like the explanation of Solomon Grundy and how he was able to give Superman such a hard time in that one issue, that Superman 301, where Superman couldn't lift him for some reason. It's like, well, how is that possible? Why isn't he like sinking through the ground then if he's so heavy that he can't be lifted? So, we tried to use that to kind of throw the theories in there and have them come from Solomon Grundy's point of view, or even Terraman's point of view, or even Lanos would come up with some kind of weird comic book science explanation. So it's fun having those different characters on there. And it kind of is it's kind of like, I recall when you had Pat Sampson on, he was talking about how Ryan Daly said that you should always have a co-host, so you're just not like talking to yourself into the ether. But I'm essentially doing that still because I voice all those other characters. Yes, the secret is out.
Oh, see, you ruined it. Show's over now. Let's go, guys.
There goes my forced reality. Though there is some exceptions, and we'll get into that a little later.
Well, I said most of my shows I do by myself. So I do, except for my G.I. Joe show, and then when I get people on here occasionally, I do most of my shows by myself. So I am the one sitting there talking to the ether and throwing it out there. But it does make it easier, and I've had people tell me that listen to my different shows, say, well, the ones when I have other guests on there, it's a little easier, it's a little more natural when you have someone else to bounce ideas off of. So
yeah, but doing it yourself works too. It's not like it's forbidden to be doing a show by yourself. I mean, the very first podcast I did was an FW Presents on the Amazing World of DC Comics, which was a DC fanzine of the 1970s. And essentially I treated that almost like a Masterpiece Theater radio show type of thing, where I would come in and just introduce a segment and then do a reading from it, and then kind of do a little exit commentary and then move on to the next one.
Very nice. So what got you into podcasting? Why did you decide to actually make the leap and get this addiction that you have?
Yeah, well, I guess I should go back into when I first discovered comic book podcasts, and the first comic book podcast I had come across was by Tom Caters. He did a series called Tom versus the Flash, and the reason I discovered that, I came across a link to an episode that was in a chat room feed. This gives you an idea of how long ago this was. So I gave it a listen, and I ended up downloading all of the shows, and I listened to them on business trips or long drives, and I enjoyed it immensely. So I kept following Tom Caters' show after he finished Tom versus the Flash and started Tom versus Aquaman. But then Tom's life had reached a point, at least at that time, where he essentially quit podcasting to devote more time to his family. In the meantime, I was drawing, illustrating for The Line It Is Drawn. That's a weekly sketch challenge feature on the Comic Book Resources website. And I know this seems unrelated, but there is a point. But there was one week where the challenge was to create a new sidekick for a hero who never had a sidekick. And I did a sidekick for Green Lantern, and I turned in my entry in the form of an old-style 1980s Who's Who entry. That was actually my very first Zoom's Who entry. And that was passed around the internet for a while, and then someone sent me a comment asking if I've ever heard of the Who's Who podcast, and I had not. So I decided to listen to it, and this was when they were at like volume 15 or 16 of the first series at the time. And that was when I first discovered Rob Kelly and Shag Matthews. And initially, they reminded me of Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew radio shows, to be honest. I mean, in terms of both their vocal styles and their banter. But
I never thought about that. You're right.
But I enjoyed these two more than Carolla and Drew. So I was listening from then on. And with Who's Who, of course, came the Fire and Water podcast, of course. And I was a Firestorm fan. I liked Aquaman. I didn't hate him, but I wasn't an avid follower of Aquaman. But I have read a number of his adventures, so it was good. And I started to appreciate Aquaman much more, listening to their podcast about that too. So with Who's Who, I wanted to. I started creating those faux Who's Who entries, as you know, starting with the Silver Age Superman and Wonder Woman, of course, because I felt they were slighted by the original Who's Who series. Because the Who's Who series, basically, they changed their direction midway through the series. I mean, they started being a celebration of DC's rich 50-year history, and that was the whole point of Who's Who. It wasn't meant to be an index. It wasn't meant to be a reference material. It wasn't meant to do what the Marvel Handbook does in terms of, who would win in a fight or whose heat vision is stronger. Then, and things like that, or who runs faster. It was more of just, these were characters that they had been publishing. Some of them may not have been published for over a decade, but, this is a character, he had a long run, and this is all you need to know about him, type of thing. And I've got bikers outside, sorry. But midway through, because of the crisis and because of all the post-crisis reboots that were happening with Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, they started to turn Who's Who into an index of characters that were featured in the comics at the time. So they never did a Who's Who entry on the Silver Age Superman, the Earth 1 Superman, in favor of the John Byrne rebooted Superman, who only appeared in, I think, about 5 comic book issues at that time. And I think they mostly pulled from John Byrne's Bible for the series to put that information in there. So, the Earth 1 Wonder Woman was slighted the same way too. So I wanted to kind of right that which was wrong and also kind of show my appreciation to the Who's Who podcast hosts. So I timed developing those for when they would be featured on their show, when those certain issues with Superman and Wonder Woman came out. And it just kept going from there. Eventually, it led to me creating a faux entry of Fire Shag, which was essentially Shag Matthews in a Firestorm costume. And because he was short of hair, he had only little tendrils of flame coming from the top of his head.
Yes, I've seen that. I've seen that picture. I love that.
And that entry was actually written by Michael Bailey.
Oh, okay.
And I wanted to do one on Aqua Rob Kelly. I needed to do that. So via Facebook, I arranged a phone call with Shag Matthews to go over what the entry should say, while sharing a few, so we had that phone call. He kept complimenting me on my voice for some reason. I don't know why. And we shared a few comic book collecting stories. I actually told him my Uncle Kenzo story on the phone. And at the end of the call, Shag basically said, Rob and I, we got to have you be a guest on our podcast. And I was a guest on episode 156 of the Fire and Water podcast. And I had a blast doing that. And that might have been when the podcasting bug actually hit me at that point. And I was later a guest on other shows of the network. There was Film and Water, there was Pod Dylan, and they were all enjoyable. So that led to my idea to do my own podcast. And I was originally planning to post it on my blog site until I could figure out how to do a channel feed. I knew I could actually post audio and video on my blog spot. So I thought if I do these episodes, I would post it there. But because of my past experience with the Fire and Water Network shows, the network founders decided to take a chance on my idea.
Very nice.
Yeah, what happened is that, I had a 5-episode plan from the start. I knew which comic book stories I wanted to cover, mainly based on whatever comic book guests I could actually pull off. And I had pretty much 95% of the show format worked out. And I actually had a pitch plan for these 5 episodes, like all written down on Notepad. And later, when a Facebook conversation lent itself on the topic of starting new podcasts, I actually just put a post on Facebook that just said, I have an idea for a podcast show that would begin with my origin of comic book collecting and end with the destruction of the universe. And it sounded like a joke, but that actually was my 5-episode plan. And whoever's listened to season 1 of the Done One Wonders, they know that's true. And this was actually a line I would later use in my first official promo for the show. And at that point, the Fire and Water Network, they started as a network, not just the Fire and Water podcast. And that was when I did that one-time guest, episode 156, as I mentioned. So I actually received a private message from Rob Kelly on Facebook a few days after I put that post on there. He basically said that he talked it over with all the podcast founders, and they were willing to actually set me up if I was serious about doing a podcast. So I actually typed up my pitch and I sent it to them. They said it sounded great, and I just went forward from there.
Oh, very nice. So we kind of talked about this a little bit already, but your vision for the show when you first started, what was your original vision? Was it just basically just covering the one issue special, or not special?
Yeah. The original vision. Yeah, the original vision was essentially the 5-episode plan that I mentioned. I definitely wanted to do those 5 stories. I definitely wanted to end with destroying the universe, because basically I figured that I just wanted it to be like a first season, like a tryout season. And if I enjoyed doing it, and if producing these podcasts didn't kill me, I would do a second season. So right now I'm hard at work recreating the universe that I destroyed at the end of episode 5. But pretty much everything that was in my original plan was done, with a few exceptions. My favorite aspect of the show format, I said I had 95% of the format. The 5% actually came to me at the 11th hour. I had recorded and edited my first episode. And at the time, it just started with the theme music and went right into the program. And I thought that was fine. I mean, a lot of other podcasts do that as well. But then I remembered how Tom Caters, remember him?
Yes.
Did Tom versus the Flash and all that. Right. He would open his show with some kind of funny, snide little grabber line. He would do something like, Tom versus the Flash, number 223, or I've never been held so tenderly by an insect, or something, just a little snide thing that makes you go, what? And makes you want to listen more and figure out what the heck is he talking about. So I wanted to open with kind of a grabber like that, but I didn't want to copy what Tom had done. So I pulled out the comic book I was covering for an idea. This was Justice League of America Volume 1, issue 111. And I realized that I could do a dramatic reading of the caption right off the cover. And I had some Hoyt Curtin soundtracks, and some of them are very similar to the music tracks he used on the Super Friends. So I had like Super Friends like music tracks I could put in there to capture that 1973 feel, because this was all about how, you know, I found that comic book because, as I mentioned earlier, I saw the Super Friends program, and then I saw the comic book, and it's like, oh, these are the guys on the show. It all just fell into place. And then I decided to just do these dramatic cover reenactments for the rest of those comic books that I had covered as the opener going forward. And I was actually fortunate to have some friends that are actually really good voice talents to kind of lend their voice in there. There's a brilliant man named Will Rogers. He's a radio personality in Kentucky, and he can mimic a lot of the Super Friends characters. So he voiced Superman in a dramatic reenactment of his battle with Solomon Grundy. He voiced the Flash, and I also have him voice Green Lantern in an upcoming episode. And I was especially honored to have Shannon Farnan, who was the voice of Wonder Woman on the Super Friends, the very first Wonder Woman voice, to actually reenact, I guess, her role as Lois Lane in the 4th episode opener, because she would also voice extra characters on the Super Friends, and one of them was actually Lois Lane in the episode Lex Luthor Strikes Back. So it was quite a joy to actually hear Shannon Farnan's voice Lois Lane for me, essentially.
Oh, very much so, I'm sure.
It was a thrill. It was a thrill, and she will actually return voicing another character in an upcoming episode opener, but I will not spoil it. But you do hear that voice in my season 2 teaser trailer that was just released in the FW sampler.
Oh, okay.
On the Fire and Water Podcast Network.
Very nice. It's a little early. I'm sure you've got 5 episodes. You start your 2nd season, but is anything
I haven't started yet. It won't air until probably September.
Oh, okay. But is anything different than what you had planned? Is things?
Yes. Well,
as a podcaster, things can change at the last minute. Has any of your plans or?
Well, there was that 11th hour ad. The other thing that changed was the comic book that was covered in the 5th episode. It was originally going to be the Flash Volume 1, Issue 139, which was actually a Silver Age book, and it was the origin story of the Reverse Flash. The rest of the episode was essentially the same. My original plan for episode 5 was to have Reverse Flash essentially take over the show and go from there to conquer the rest of comic book fandom. You had to be there. And of course, spoilers, the idea of defeating him had to do with his speed charged costume. He actually gets his powers from his costume. It's not internal like Barry Allen's. And that was the means to defeat him. And that would be inspired by the mention of that in the comic book story itself. That would be what triggers the idea, because we review the story and that's like, now I can know how to defeat him. And that's essentially what, they had a similar mention in the replacement story, because I noticed that most of the comic books I'd been covering on the show, they were in the Bronze Age, with the exception of maybe Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, which opened the door to Reverse Flash, because that was actually the first appearance of the Bizarro Flash, which happened to look like Reverse Flash. And because of that similarity, that's what leads to Reverse Flash getting on the show, because Lanos thought Reverse Flash was supposed to be the guest star and accidentally released him from his 25th century prison before he realized his mistake and then went to go get Bizarro, because that Bizarro was supposed to be the guest star. And of course, because Reverse Flash escaped and ended up in our studio, he knocked me out and took over the show. But because I was covering Bronze Age stories more, I switched the Silver Age story I originally had with a Bronze Age Reverse Flash tale that also highlighted the speed charged uniform in one scene. The Flash actually defeats Reverse Flash by taking his uniform off. I mean, the Flash takes Reverse Flash's uniform off. Let me be clear there. But anyway, the episode still worked, and it was in line with the Bronze Aginess of most of the other episodes. That was good. Oh, one other thing. I originally toyed with the idea of having Elron, the robot from Justice League International, being one of the regular characters on my show. I wanted to have a computer or robot character to pull the data files, read the Who's Who entries, give out the scientific explanations, essentially be the nerd. on the show. And I gave Elron a tryout. Right. Doing the voice and character of Elron. I gave him a tryout in the teaser promos that were used in my FW Presents The Amazing World of DC Comics. And it worked pretty well. But because I saw my podcast focusing more on pre-crisis comic books, Elron didn't seem to be a very good fit. But Lanos from the Green Lantern animated series, which I love that series, and it's criminally underrated, and it's unfortunate that they didn't continue with it. But Lanos seemed to be a better fit for the show, even though, again, he has nothing to do with Green Lantern comics, pre-crisis or otherwise. But I like that character on the show. And the series itself, the animated series, told some good single-episode stories, and I may actually want to cover a special episode later. I don't have to refine myself to done-in-one comic book wonders.
Right. Yeah, the name of your show is Done-in-One Wonder Show, so, I mean, you could cover whatever you want at that point.
Exactly. I might actually end up doing a Super Friends episode.
There you go. That would be very nice.
Why not?
Which kind of leads me to my next... Sorry, anything else?
No, I just thought of one, so I got to write that down. That was the other thing, too. I originally had a 5-episode plan, but as I was doing the 5 episodes, I kept coming up with comic books that I wanted to cover later, and I actually have a list. I have a list of about 20 different comic books I want to do. So, by episode 3, I said that I already have like the first 15 or so episodes mapped out, and that's true because I already had the list of comics. But I am asking people to, send in their recommendations of done-in-one stories, and some of them went on the list.
Very nice. Speaking of that, I don't know how far you got planned. I know you got 15 stories lined up, but for your second season,
yes.
Do you plan on doing just another 5 episodes? Are you planning on going longer for the second season, or have you figured that out yet? How far you're going with that one?
Well, I was hoping this would be a monthly series, but it actually takes a little bit longer than that. Mostly because I am pretty meticulous.
Right.
So it takes about maybe a month and a half to do an episode on average, and that's assuming, it takes about a week to 2 weeks to get a script together. And in fact, at least a week to get a script together enough to start recording. I do full scripts, but just like any kind of production, rewrites are usually done in recording when I find out that a line doesn't quite work. When, it works in my head, but it doesn't work when I hear it out loud. But I'm trailing away from your question. Sorry. As I stated before, I'm 55 and I'm starting to ramble now. So
it's happened.
It does. But going back to it, I'm planning on doing seasons of 5 episodes at a time. But I probably will not have too long of a hiatus in between episodes like I'm doing, or in between seasons like I'm doing between season 1 and 2. The reason I had a hiatus is because I'm actually working on a few other projects. There was the FW sampler for one. And I wanted to do another Amazing World of DC Comics FW Presents, but I'm actually going to put that off to between seasons 2 and 3. But I'm actually planning a podcast around my experience of The Line It Is Drawn. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because I don't want to jinx it.
Very nice. So you've got a second season, third season, fourth season planned out.
I guess so, technically, yes.
You may do some other Fire and Water FW Presents shows. Do you have any other plans at this point for other podcasts, or seeing how it takes you so long to do the one, or are you just going to stick with the one for now?
I'm sticking with the one for now, but there are times when, like I said, there's these individual ideas that may not be a series, but it's like, I want to do a podcast on it, like The Amazing World of DC Comics, for example. So it's like, if I ever get an idea like that, if I just come across something going, hey, I want to talk about this, then I'll put an FW Presents together. The Line It Is Drawn is going to be an FW Presents thing. So that's the neat thing about the FW Presents anthology series that they developed, where if you just have an idea but it can't carry its own show, you can just stick it right on there. And it can also be like a backdoor pilot, too.
Yep.
because if somehow that initial podcast germinates, it's like the first issue special of podcasts that may or may not take off. I think The Warlord was the only one that got his own series. Lady Cop didn't.
Did Manhunter ever get a series out of that, or maybe not?
No, but Manhunter did make an appearance in Justice League. Manhunter didn't end up getting his series until after Millennium. Believe it or not, that was actually one of the few good things that actually came out of Millennium. The Millennium event in 1980, was it 88?
87, 88.
Yeah. The years are blurring for me now. I used to be really good at what year was what.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if there was a series before Mark Shaw's or not. So the one I'm covering, Mark Shaw's, was the first actual Manhunter series then.
That's right. And Mark Shaw did make that appearance that retconned the whole Manhunter cult as being the precursor to the Green Lantern Corps, which was actually a pretty good idea, I thought.
Yeah, that was a nice touch.
Yeah. So basically, Mark Shaw was like the Manhunter of Sector 2814.
Yeah, you could look at it that way.
Yeah, but I have a feeling that was not what Jack Kirby had in mind.
No,
I think Jack Kirby was just creating another, Cobra or Secret Society or something.
Yeah, it sounds more likely.
Yes.
But DC and their wisdom likes to tie things together, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work as well.
Yeah, like tying Commandy and OMAC together. I don't know if that was Kirby's original plan, to be honest. I don't think it was.
Probably not. But we'll never know.
Yep.
So far, like I say, you've got one season in, you've done some other specials. What's been the biggest obstacle, if any, with your show as it is right now?
Well, let's see. I did say I was pretty meticulous, but
a good thing could also be a bad thing.
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, well, I'll get into that later. I'll talk about why I like being meticulous. To be honest, it has to do with my love of editing, but I would say finding time to record is the biggest obstacle. My home has very thin walls, and I didn't mention this, but I'm actually hemiplegic. It was basically I had tumors on my spinal cord a few years ago. They resulted in me having stroke-like symptoms, and one attack got so bad I actually had to get emergency surgery to get them removed. And while they were successfully removed, there were complications. I essentially lost most of the use of my left arm and legs. So because of that disability, I cannot really be left at home alone. So I have to find a time when the rest of the family is either doing a quiet activity and my Solomon Grundy and Bizarro voices won't disturb them, essentially. The best time is actually when my wife is taking the kids out somewhere and it's just me and my part-time home care nurse, who probably had to put up with a lot worse from other patients than Solomon Grundy and Bizarro voices. To be honest, Raul's actually totally cool with it. He actually asked me to have Terraman record a birthday greeting for his 6-year-old son the other month.
Oh, very nice. That's nice. So you talk. You are married. You got kids.
Yes.
You got your disability, if you will.
It's my new normal. It's my new normal, and it's actually a good thing. I mean, I'm probably jumping to one of your other questions of what I enjoy most about podcasting. Really, is that it's a great creative outlet. It's no secret that I used to actually draw backgrounds for Hong Kong manhwa comics. That was like my first dream job, was to do work on comic books. And I already mentioned that I doodle quite a bit on the line it is drawn for comic book resources. But since I became a hemiplegic a couple of years ago, it's been just getting harder and harder for me to be drawing for extended lengths of time. I still have a good use of my right hand. I can still draw fairly well. In fact, I've recently submitted to the line that's drawn, just not as regularly as I used to, because it's not comfortable drawing for long periods of time, as I had stated. So I've been drawing less and less, and I needed another creative outlet, and podcasting is that new outlet, because I can just sit here and talk And the neat thing about my show is I get to play. I'd done character voices for radio spots and radio station programs when I was living in Southeast Asia in the mid-1990s, and I had a blast doing that. So being able to do that again with the Zoom crew, it makes this project especially fun. And getting into the characters' heads to write their script and their comic book commentary, that allows me to even stretch myself even further creatively. So, and then of course another advantage of the Zoom crew characters is that they enable me to be my own co-host, as I stated earlier. So that makes recording a podcast easy to schedule.
Yeah, that's the one that on my G.I. Joe show, that's one of the problems I've had is trying to find times I can get, like we
Get
talked
everybody
about
together. Yeah, it's like herding cats, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so, especially like we talked about, I think it was on the other, during the Flash, and you'll give me on the West Coast. Most of the podcasters I know are on the East Coast or Midwest, so yeah, it's hard to line up a time when I'm free, they're free. And like I say, having your own co-host in your head, that actually makes it easy too. So.
Yeah, I heard the cat's in my head. That's what I do. But the downside is that when one of us gets a sore throat, and yes, I'm talking about you, Grundy, everyone on the show gets a sore throat.
This is true.
Yeah, that's the only downside. But you were asking me about my family. I have a feeling I know where this is going.
Well, I'm just curious, how does your family, I know you try to do it mostly when they're out, when they're busy doing something else, but how does your family feel about your podcasting? Are they supportive of it, or?
They are supportive of it. My wife is actually very happy that I have another creative outlet. But there have been times when she would walk in while I'm talking like Terra Man, and I catch her with that look, and she shakes her head on the way back out. But she's also a reader of comic books. But mostly the more sophisticated series like Sand. And of course I share an interest in those comic books too. So we have something that we can talk about. She finds the superhero comic books to be hokey and silly. And that's okay because I do too. I just might see more charm in that hokiness than she does. That's all.
So if you don't mind me asking, how long have you been married?
I have been married for 11 years now.
Very good. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
In this day and age, that's a milestone.
I suppose it is. And yeah, I honestly don't know what I've done to deserve her, really, especially now.
Right.
Before what's happened, I mean, she had to put up with a lot with me already. Now she has to put up with a lot more, but she's just, my kids are amazing too.
Oh, that's good. That's always a good thing when your family supports you and they help you out and they, however they can. Or at least, supporting you and being there when you need it, and especially what you've been through recently.
Yeah.
That's very good to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my son had actually taken part in my podcast by actually helping me edit the first 2 episodes of my show. Okay. Mainly because he wanted to learn the craft.
Right. How old is your son?
He is now 13. He'll be 14 later. He was actually born before I before I started dating my wife. Right. So he's really my stepson, but he might as well be my son, really.
No, I understand. Yeah, I've got 2 boys from a previous marriage. Yeah, my wife, might as well be her son. So
right.
I know exactly what you're referring to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your son's helps you out editing and stuff. Have you had your family, your wife, or the kids, or do you plan on having them on a podcast, or are they interested in that?
They have no interest in it. I was originally thinking there was a time when I was almost wondering, like, because I was going back to when I was 10 years old, to have actually my son, act as a 10-year-old me,
right.
to talk about the comic book, and he was like, "Nah, I don't want to do that." So it's like, fine, you don't have to. And to be honest, after the first 2 episodes, he does his own audio editing projects. So I'm editing my show on my own, which is fine. As I said, I love editing. But no, and my wife definitely won't be on there. In fact, Terra Man actually joked about this during a listener feedback section when somebody was suggesting that I have a female comic book character guest star.
Right.
It was like, yeah, the chances of that happening are as much the chances of my wife actually taking part in my podcast, which is true.
Yeah, I've got my wife on 1 or 2 episodes, but yeah, it's...
You did?
Yeah. Yeah, I got to talk about Game of Thrones. She loves Game of Thrones, so I got to talk about that. And
well, there you go.
So, Yeah, so speaking of wives, you said your wife does like comics to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you got her into, or did you find a geek?
I actually found a geek. She was reading Sandman.
Oh, okay.
She was reading Sandman when she was in college. So, and of course, I graduated college before Sandman even came out. So, but yeah.
Yeah, wow, it's been some years now. Yeah, but
but it's so yeah, she was into Sandman. She was into a lot of the fantasy things. She was into A Distant Soil. In fact, she had some original tabloid size black and white A Distant Soil when it was first published. Oh, okay. Those books before it was picked up by, I think it was Image later. So in fact, I think she ended up dropping out of collecting A Distant Soil because she didn't go to the direct comic book shops, and I ended up being able to help her complete her collection nice. In the first few years that we were together. So that was very nice.
So let's say you do the shows yourself with your mental co-host, if you will. Is there any special guests that you like to get on your show in the future, either podcasters or creators or anyone else that you would like to have on your show?
Well, that's interesting because, what I've been doing recently, and it's been really fun, is actually doing the Wonder Show comic book character concept with other people. For example, going back to the recent FW sampler, now available on fireandwaterpodcast.com, my Solomon Grundy met Chris Franklin's Solomon Grundy. At first, I was a little concerned about doing Solomon Grundy on my show. The reason I put Solomon Grundy on my show is because I could do Solomon Grundy. But Chris Franklin already had kind of a little Solomon Grundy bit that he did off and on. In fact, he did a brilliant one for April Fools the other year, where it was Solomon Grundy show on a Monday, which was like a fake promo for a Solomon Grundy podcast.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing that one.
It was great, and I was just a little concerned that I might be like stepping on his territory. But the neat thing about the podcasting community is that there are no egos, Shag Matthews notwithstanding, but there's no competition, so to speak. There's no rivalry. We're all supporting each other's shows. We're all encouraging each other, and there was room for two Solomon Grundys on the network, as proven by having the two Solomon Grundys meet. And it ended up being like almost a 10-minute segment, and it was a blast to do. And that FW sampler also had my Elron sharing some segments with Shag Matthews, Lord Manga Khan. Which was fun. I mean, even though we collaborated on the segments beforehand and a script was fully written out, I still was very surprised by the tracks that I got back from other people. Right. In fact, my first teaser promo for the Wonder Show podcast was my pitching the idea to the network founders in a slideshow presentation in a conference room. And I wrote out the script, and the founders were all making this snide commentary throughout that I wasn't really supposed to hear, that I supposedly could not hear. Let's put it that way. And it was just such a thrill to see other people get into the concept and how much it comes through on their delivery. So I am planning a few episodes in season 2 where another person besides me will be portraying a comic book character, and I'm really looking forward to recording those. I'm not going to go into who, what characters, because again, I don't want to jinx it. Oh yes, that's right, surprise. Yeah, people dig a podcast of mystery.
Yes. What was there else that you like to tell the audience about yourself that we haven't covered yet? Behind the scenes Zoom that you'd like to share with the world? If you really want to, if you want some behind the scenes Zoom, you should just check out my blog. And it's not like I want to send you somewhere to just have to read, but right. No, that's definitely.
But basically, the reason I tell some stories of things that happened in my life. I tell some thoughts about certain things, but it's not like political commentary or anything like that. But it's just kind of give you an idea of where I'm at that. And just some of the experiences that have shaped my life. I've actually told the story of the first girl I have ever loved and lost. I have told the story of how I actually teamed up with the Power Rangers once in a shopping mall publicity event, and that has an unexpected twist that Brian Cronin from CBR says that I should do a webcomic on it, and maybe I will. But you can read the whole story now if you want. It's called Protector in Pink if you're looking for it. I have told the story of how I met my wife and how we got together. That was actually a series of posts. And the reason I put all those down is that, when you tell a story about something that happened to you, there seems to be this natural tendency to keep embellishing it every time you tell it. And sometimes the story just kind of diverts away from what really happened. So I wanted to just get it down once. And then that saves me from having to retell the story again. So that's why I'm directing people to just go to that blog. It's at Xum Yukinori at blogspot.com. That's the URL. And hopefully you enjoy it. And you know what? I also talked about the origin of my name.
Very nice. The Who's pages. Who's?
Yeah, we call it Zoom's Who.
Zoom's Who. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have those? I know Shag's posted some more with the Firestorm fan website.
Yeah,
Do you have them up somewhere, or?
I don't yet. I do not. I think some of them were on the Tumblr. I think they are all available on the Fire and Water Podcast Network website. But I think you have to do a search. I think you have to do a search for my name or something to find them all.
I did a search on your name on Google, and under images it came up, and there's some on there also. And I just have to say, I'm looking at some of these. I love that Firestorm, the Nuclear Muppets.
That was for The Line Is Drawn. The Line Is Drawn, again, as I said, it was a sketch challenge. The reason it's a sketch challenge is that Brian Cronin, who is one of the regular writers of Comic Book Resources, he's one of the regular columnists, he would come up with a theme, like mash a superhero with the Muppets. And then people on Twitter would send suggestions to him. They would actually tweet a suggestion to him in response to that theme. And then he would give us the list of tweet suggestions without the names of the people who provided them, so it's kind of like a blind selection. And sometimes there'd be lists of like 100. There was one time there was a list of like 300 possible ideas, and we would just pick one and then we would draw it. So there was one where it was Honeydew and Beaker form Firestorm. So yeah, that's where Firestorm the Nuclear Muppet came in. And of course, very early on, I was doing like these mock comic book covers, and I just enjoyed doing that trade dress and either using actual trade dress, of which I was able to get from the DC Comics Style Guide, or with the logos and such, or actually tweaking an existing one. So yeah, so it's Firestorm the Nuclear Muppet instead of the Nuclear Man.
And I do have to say, not to wax your car, I think it's Michael Bailey says, but I'm looking at some of your Who's on the Fire and Water website, and
yes,
they're great. Zoom's Who's are...
Yeah, I didn't come up with... I originally was going to call them Who's That?
Right.
And I actually came up with a logo that was Who's That? In fact, if you go to the Fire Shag entry, you'll see the Who's That logo in the corner. But then when there was a suggestion on The Line It Is Drawn, actually, where it would be that somebody actually, it was like New Year's resolutions. That's what it was. And it was Zoom will stop drawing DC comic characters or something like that. And that inspired me to actually do a Who's Who cover filled with DC comic characters, basically saying that I broke my resolution right out of the gate. And I had a list of characters that I wanted to do, Zoom's Who entries on, and I was doing them, but to actually do a cover, that meant I had to come up with, 32 pages of entries. So I had my list and there wasn't enough. So it was like, okay, now I got to pick like 7 other characters to add to this list. And it kind of forced me within a day to figure out, okay, who else am I going to do Zoom's Who entries on? And now I'm committed to it because I put it down in writing.
Right.
So I don't know if you see the cover there among those entries.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So
That's very nice.
I had a blast doing that. And because it was over the Christmas holiday, I actually had an extra week to do it. So no, I did not do that in less than a week. I did that in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I don't want to say it's realistic, but it looks very much like Who's Who's.
Oh yeah,
It's very.
I love how George Perez would have all the characters kind of interact or react to each other. But that's where I came up with the idea of actually calling it Zoom's Who at that point. And this was also during the phase when it was during my 52nd year of life.
Right.
And we're going way off the podcast thing here, but I decided to challenge myself because ever since I started doing The Line It Is Drawn back in like week 80 something, I have never been able to contribute on a weekly basis. There would always be a week or two that I would miss. So what was funny is that on my 52nd birthday happened to be it was June 5th, and it was also the week when the new 52 from DC was actually ending, and they were becoming the DCU, YOU. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a 52-week challenge for my 52nd year of life, and I'm going to call it the Zoom 52. So you'll notice that you'll notice on at least the Line It Is Drawn version, you'll see a Zoom 52 logo on
that's
there.
what I was laughing about earlier.
And that's why Zoom is there. That's why Zoom is there too, because this became an experiment. This became a double experiment. It was an experiment in terms of, one, let's see if I can do this on a weekly basis. And surprisingly, I did, because I told you about how I had that attack.
Right.
And I was hospitalized and I lost that actually happened during the end of the Zoom 52. It happened shortly before my 53rd birthday.
Oh.
And yet I still managed to get those last few weeks out. So that's how crazy I was, and probably how distracted I wanted to make myself, I guess, when that happened. But also part of that Zoom 52 challenge was not just getting them out on a weekly basis, but also putting in a cameo of myself in there. Every single week of the Zoom 52, I had drawn myself in there, usually in a kind of like a kung fu superhero type of persona, which was called Professor Zoom. That's where the Professor Zoom name came from much earlier, but he was kind of a recurring character. And like 3-4 weeks in, we already started getting comments complaining. It's like, can you stop with the Zoom stuff, or enough with the Zoom stuff? So it was also kind of an experiment of how much people would put up with it. And I found out, okay, 3 weeks, but I was committed to it. So I kept up with it. But, there was a time where there was 1 week where the Sandman was teamed up, and we're talking about Neil Gaiman's Sandman, was teamed up with Detective John Munch from Homicide.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember how the theme came up, but we actually had a John Munch week because one of the other artists, John Trumbull, was a fan of Homicide: Life in the Street. And John Munch, played by Richard Belzer, was his favorite character. So we actually had what was called a Munch Week theme on occasion. I think we had like 3 or 4 of them. So in one of those that happened during the Zoom 52, it was going to be John Munch and Sandman, and basically they come across my dead body, and pinned to the shirt of my dead body is a note that just says enough. So it's like, yes, I was listening. I was listening to the fans.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I was just, while you're talking, I'm looking through your blog. Fascinating. It's just I'm gonna get lost in here one of these days. It's just it's very nice. I definitely recommend people check it out.
Well, hopefully it won't be boring. I basically only just tell the stories that I end up telling a bunch of people, or that my wife loves to tell other people. So I figure, there must be something compelling about those particular stories. So those are the ones I stuck with. I have to admit, I haven't put up anything on the blog lately, like over a year now. It's just been I've been too busy podcasting.
Right. Well, that's like I said. You fall down that rabbit hole, and Well, I started with 1 or 2 podcasts, now I'm doing 4. I was going to do another one, which didn't have time, so it's an addicting.
I mean, the story of Uncle Kenzo and how I first got into comic books, that was originally going to be a blog post, but it ended up being the first episode of Done in One Wonders. And, of course, in the 6th episode, I actually share another personal story of mine for about 20-some minutes. So I'm hoping that but I guess, sometimes the podcasting allows me to kind of share a little bit of myself as well as my love of comics. And, you could always use the scroll bar to skip ahead if that's not really what you want to listen to. I always try and do. I mean, I'm not. What am I trying to say here? I guess I follow the philosophy of the Fire and Water Network mantra of find your joy. And in my version of that when I do my podcast is I do my podcast for me. I create something that I would like and something that I would find entertaining or enjoyable. I do it for me so I would have fun doing it. If I try to conform to what I think an audience wants to hear or a particular type of audience wants to hear, then that becomes more stress than fun to me because I would find myself constantly second guessing what would work for other people. But I definitely know what works for me because I've lived with myself for 55 years. So I guess, if I was as a fledgling podcaster giving advice to aspiring podcasters out there, I would say create the podcast for you and then just put it out there. And if other people like it, that's a bonus. Especially, if you bring joy to other people you don't even know, as Pat Sampson from the Longbox Crusade had said on another episode of Behind the Podcast. I mean, creating for yourself already makes it worth it, but bringing joy to others makes it more so.
Oh, very much. Like on the Pat episode or one of the other ones I've talked about. Sometimes I do the podcast because I want to talk about these comics. I enjoy it. It gives a way for me to vent and to talk about things. And
yes.
And sometimes I get, well, is it worth it? Am I talking to myself here? Is anyone else listening really? And then every once in a while I'll get an email or a message from someone that says, I really enjoyed this last episode. It meant something to me. And those kind of messages just, like you said, we would do this ourselves even if no one else was listening. But it makes you feel good to know someone else is listening and either experience the same thing you've gone through, or read the same comics you've read and have some of the same thoughts. So I agree 100% with you there, Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, when I talked about my uncle Kenzo in episode 1, I have to admit, I was a little worried that it would turn a lot of people off because I was worried that I was going, too personal with it. But just the responses that I got from that episode, and of course, even Shag Matthews says, "Hey, put yourself out there. That's what you're doing." People are not just listening to what you're saying; they want to listen to you. So yeah, I'm gonna be me. And there is a comic book story that reminded me of a very tragic thing that happened in my life. So, to fully understand why I appreciate this comic or why this comic book story touched me the way it did, you have to know what that story is. So I have to take 20 minutes and go into it. And hopefully people kind of, get where I'm at.
Very nice. It's a good way of putting it. I like that. Well, again, I've had you on the line for a while, and I think we've covered your podcasting career.
Short as it was. Short as it is.
That's all right.
That way. It's still going.
It's still going, yes, and hopefully it's a long time. Like I said, I'm so far on my podcast. I've got yours downloaded to listen to. I'm just trying to get caught up on everything.
Oh, that's
I fall down that rabbit hole of finding new. Damn it! Don't start another podcast. I don't have time for another one.
Well, that's the neat thing. That's the neat thing of doing just little five episode seasons.
Yeah.
And to be honest, these kind of, they're done in one wonders, but they kind of connect a little bit. You appreciate it more if you actually listen to them in order. In season 2, with the exception of the first episode of season 2, which is episode 6, they don't have to be listened in a particular order. I was setting up the continuity of the show, essentially, with those first 5 episodes. So now that that's been established, it's going to be almost like, any kind of, like Flintstones cartoon. You can watch them in any order. They're not necessarily going to be referring to each other
Right.
as much as my first 5 episodes do.
Right. Well, thank you very much for stopping and talking with me. Like I said last time, I enjoy listening to your voice. As she was saying, Shag said, yeah, you got a very good voice for podcasting. But where can people? We've kind of covered this on and off throughout the show. But if people want to go to your blog or listen to your show, where can they find you?
Sure.
Final plug for everything.
Yeah, sure. Again, at the Fire and Water Podcast Network, you can do a search. You can do a keyword search for Xum Yukinori or Professor Xum, Xum, and it'll pull up. It should pull up all of the podcasts that I had done, which is mostly the Done in One Wonders Podcast Wonder Show, as well as episodes of Film and Water and Fire and Water and Treasury Cast, Pod Dylan, Saturday Morning Fever. I actually talked with Rob Kelly much longer than he planned to about a Sid and Marty Krofft show called Far Out Space Nuts.
Lunch. I said lunch, not lunch. Where is the world that they used to know, and how will they ever return? Now they got a home where strangers roam. Something better help them along. So step right up and take a look at the stars. You're leaving the world behind. Oh, step right up, you won't believe your eyes at what those far out spacemen find. At what those far out spacemen find.
Yes, I listened to that. I enjoyed that episode. I enjoyed that TV show.
Oh, good. That makes 2 of us. I think there's like 3 other people out there in the universe that enjoyed that show too.
I enjoyed all that Sid and Marty Krofft. I love the Far Out Space Nuts.
Yes, Far Out Space Nuts. It's a
great show.
Yeah, Rob thought it was only going to be like a 10-minute show, but you know.
that's what happens when you start. Oh, it's going to take 10, 20 minutes. I'll be done.
Yeah.
2 hours later, what were we talking about again?
Right. So fireandwaterpodcast.com is where you can find those. And then, of course, my blog spot, Xum-Yukinori at blogspot.com. It is called Omelette au fromage because they're basically cheesy thoughts from my brain. And I am also a semi-regular contributor to The Line It Is Drawn, which is on cbr.com. I think if you just go there and then type in Line It Is Drawn, just like the Bob Dylan line, in the search engine, it should pull all of those up.
Well, again, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your night to talk with me, for appearing on my show once again.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. I think this Behind the Podcast is a neat concept.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I talked about it before. It was Adam Worth's idea for his show, and he wasn't going to use it. Beyond that, he said, do you mind if I use this? Go for it. I'm like, right on. So,
yeah, maybe someday I'll have a successor to the Done in One Wonders Podcast Wonder Show.
You never know what'll happen.
Even if I have imitators, I welcome them because we want to enrich the podcasting community.
Oh, very much so. Well, again, thank you very much for appearing, and hopefully we can talk about something else one of these days on one of my shows or something.
Sure.
I enjoy talking with you.
Thank you.
And again, as we said earlier, both being on the West Coast, it makes it easier to connect up.
That is true. At least it's not like somebody is trying to stay awake.
It's most of my guys. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Are we done yet? Are we still doing this thing?
Yep. Hey, Johnny Carson had that problem. He had to make those chairs uncomfortable just to keep his guests from falling asleep when they flew in from California to New York. Or was it from New York to California? I think it was from New York to California. I'm getting my time zones mixed up.
I think Johnny Carson in years. Just watch that once in a while. Anyways, that's another topic entirely.
It is. You can edit all that out.
I mean, I enjoy that kind of stuff. Well, again, thank you very much for joining me.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime. It was a blast.
Thank you.